This is the first lesson in the Living World section of your GCSE course. In this section, we will study what ecosystems are and how they function before studying case studies of the Amazon rainforest and a cold environment. There is some overlap with your science GCSEs, so some of the concepts may already be familiar to you. So let's start by asking what is an ecosystem, and let's look at a small ecosystem, a pond, to find out how they function. To start with, here are some keywords that you need to know. So pause this video, read through those keywords, and when you're ready, restart. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of plants and animals that interact with each other and their physical environment. So in this photograph, the tree interacts with the sunlight to make glucose, the squirrel eats the acorns from the tree, interacting with the tree, and the stones are weathered to make minerals that the tree then absorbs to make the acorns. Ecosystems exist on a number of scales. They can be very small, like a little pond, or a hedgerow, or even a log. Or they can be very large and cover big areas of the globe, like a tropical rainforest or a desert. In this case, they're called biomes. Let's take the example of a small-scale ecosystem, a pond. And we can see that it's made up of these living or biotic components and non-living or abiotic components. Just pause this video and make a note of what you think are some of the biotic and some of the abiotic components of this pond. The abiotic components, which relate to non-living things, you may have thought about light, water, oxygen, soil, temperature, and all these will vary in different parts of the pond. The biotic components, you may have thought about the ducks or the water boatmen or the reeds growing at the side, and they will live where conditions are just right for them. So they will live in different parts of the pond. So at the bottom of the pond, where there's not much light and there's not much oxygen, you're going to find your worms and your maggots and your decomposers. Whereas your fish, they need a lot more oxygen to be absorbed through their gills. So they're going to live in the middle of the pond where they can go to the top to feed, they can go to the bottom to feed, but their optimal conditions is in the middle of the pond. On the surface of the pond, you're going to get animals that breathe through their lungs, where oxygen is light at optimal. So you've got the ducks on the top of the surface. At the sides of the ponds where you've got the reeds, that makes really good hiding shelter for frogs and snails. So they're going to be found in the reeds at the side. Even the plants will grow in different parts of the pond. So the water lilies like slightly shallower water to grow in. So they'll be found towards the edges of the pond, not right in the middle. The living parts of the pond are either producers, consumers, or decomposers. So producers are plants which trap sunlight energy in their leaves, and they use this to make sugars or glucose in a process called photosynthesis. Consumers eat the plant matter or each other, and they get their energy from the sugars made by the producers. So it might be a snail or rabbit or a fox. Now rabbits eat grass, so they're called herbivores. Foxes eat rabbits, so they're called carnivores. They eat meat. Decomposers are very important because they take the dead animals and plants and they break down the dead tissue, releasing the nutrients back into the soil so it can be reused. So energy and nutrients are moved through an ecosystem as the interactions happen between the different components. The links between producers and consumers can be shown through a food chain. So a food chain is a series of lines that shows what is eaten by whom. Now pause this PowerPoint and see if you can find a food chain in this pond ecosystem. Now in this pond there is only one producer, so this is where we start. We start with the algae and the microscopic plants. So what eats them? Well, they're eaten by mayfly. What eats the mayfly? The caddisfly eats the mayfly. What eats the caddisfly? The fish, and the fish are then eaten by the birds. So that would be one food chain. You could also have started with the algae and said that midge larvae eat the algae, and then the diving beetle eats the midge larva, the fish eat the beetles, and the birds eat the fish. So there you have two food chains. So in reality, consumers usually eat more than one thing. So the interactions between producers and consumers is a lot more complex, and we end up with a food web rather than a food chain. See if you can rearrange these images to create a food web for this pond ecosystem. So here's a tidy version of the food web, and as you can see, the arrows are going from the producers, the algae, through to the primary consumers, the mayfly, up to the secondary consumers, your dragonfly and your beetles, up to your tertiary consumers, your fish, all the way up to your birds at the top. Now, if you alter one part of this food web, it's going to shift the balance and it's going to alter another part of the food web. So take one animal out and there'll be less food for the next level up. So I want you to think about these three questions. Firstly, what would happen if the number of birds increased? Secondly, what would happen if the amount of microscopic plants increased? And thirdly, what would happen if the amount of algae increased so much that sunlight was blocked out? So pause this video and try and answer those three questions. Firstly, if birds increased, more fish would be eaten, so there would be fewer fish. So fewer caddisfly and dragonflies and beetles would be eaten. So their numbers would increase. So if their numbers increase, they're going to be eating more of the level below. So the mayfly and the midge larva will decrease. Now, if this level decreases, less algae will be eaten. So the algae and the microscopic plants would increase. Now, secondly, if the amount of algae and plants increase, that means there's more food for the next level up. So their numbers will increase as more will survive. If the number of mayfly and midge larvae increases, there's more food for the next level up. So more of those will survive and their numbers will increase. So if caddisfly, dragonfly and beetles increase, there'll be more food for the fish, so more fish will survive and their numbers will increase. Up to the birds. If there's more fish, the number of birds will increase. But then you have a negative feedback. So if the bird numbers increase, they will then start eating more fish, so the number of fish will decrease, and so on, as in scenario 1. Now, if the amount of algae increased so much that the sunlight was blocked out in the pond, how would that affect the pond? Well, the water would get colder because there's less sunlight coming in, and the water will be more dense and start to sink. So less of that water will be in contact with the surface of the pond, and so that will have less oxygen in it, and the fish need the oxygen. So that's going to affect the fish. At the same time, any plants living underneath the algae will also not be able to access the sunlight and they will start to die, and there will be less oxygen again for the fish. As the fish and the plants underneath the algae start to die, there'll be more decomposition. The decomposers use up the oxygen, and again that's even less oxygen available in the water for the fish and more fish will die. Have a look at this food web, not of a pond but of a wood. So you have the primary producers, your plants, making glucose from sunlight energy during photosynthesis. They're getting eaten by your primary consumers, like your caterpillars, your rabbits, your voles, that are getting eaten by your secondary consumers, your birds, your mouse, your badgers, that are then getting eaten by tertiary consumers, sparrowhawk, foxes and tawny owls at the top of the food chain. Now, have a look at these two questions. Suggest what would happen in the food web if foxes became extinct. You took foxes out, what would happen? Secondly, state one role of decomposers in an ecosystem. Pause this PowerPoint and see if you can answer those two questions. If foxes became extinct, then fewer moles and rabbits would be eaten, so their numbers would increase as more survive. Moles eat beetles, so as mole numbers increase, beetle numbers would decrease. Rabbits eat plants, so if rabbit numbers increase, more plants will be eaten. If more rabbits eat more plants, then they are in competition for food with the caterpillars and the voles, who also eat the plants, so maybe caterpillars and vole numbers will decrease. Decomposers use enzymes to break down dead plants and animals into nutrients like sugars and salts. These nutrients are then available in the soil to be absorbed through plant roots, and then they re-enter the food chain. Some nutrients, however, are washed out of the ecosystem by rain. Ecosystems, as we've seen, are very fragile, so if you change one component, it may well have a knock-on effect for the rest of the ecosystem. So what causes these changes? Well, these changes could be natural and they could be human-induced. So have a look at this photograph. It just shows some of the human causes of change. Some of these you would have come across. So if you cut down the woods, you're destroying the habitats for birds and affecting the nutrient cycle. If you remove hedges, again, you're destroying habitats and you'll be altering the amount of animals and plants that live in a place. Ponds may be drained for farming. You've looked at the draining of the Somerset levels lower down the school, destroying vole habitats. And something we'll have a look at in the next slide is adding fertilizers in farming causes something called eutrophication, which can destroy fish life in ponds. Have a look at this pond on the right hand side. Can you see how green it's become? That's because you've got algae that are growing out of control because the water has become enriched with too many nutrients. Where have they come from? Have a look at the left hand side. You can see this farmer is spraying the crops with fertilizers to make those plants grow. Some of those fertilizers will have drained into this pond and the algae absolutely love it and go wild and just grow out of control. However, what the effect of that is depleting the water underneath of oxygen. This is a process called eutrophication, and there's a little video here you can watch about that. Here's a lovely little diagram all about eutrophication. So the first thing that happens is you've got excessive nutrients from fertilizers are flushed into the rivers or lakes through rain. And then the plants flourish and they cause overgrowth of algae, especially on the surface, and these algae use up the oxygen and they stop sunlight reaching the other plants. So these plants at the bottom will die and the oxygen in the water will get used up. More plants dying means there's more litter on the bottom of the pond and there's more decomposition. Decomposition uses up even more oxygen. And so there's even less available for the animals that are living in the water. And eventually the oxygen levels reach a point where no life is possible and the fish and other organisms die. See if you can rearrange these cards into the right order to show what happens during eutrophication. Check that you have the right order. Ecosystems can be affected by natural change as well as man-made change, and if it's slow, it's okay, then ecosystem can usually adapt. But if it's an extreme event, ecosystems don't have time to react. So if you look at the photograph on the top right here, these are the forest fires that we saw last year in Australia and southwest USA and California, and you could see forest fires are instantly going to destroy an ecosystem, the plants and the animals that are living there. Also last summer we saw drought. Lots of the rivers are really low level in this country, and we saw the Environment Agency trying to rescue fish because there simply wasn't enough oxygen to keep those fish alive. So floods would also affect ecosystems, wildfires, diseases. The spread of diseases can affect ecosystems. We're suffering from something called ash dieback in this country, which is affecting ash trees. And as we see climate change, we're going to see more and more diseases coming to our country that didn't used to affect plants in this country and affect the ecosystems.